Hotep Black Power, everyone. This is Doshon Farad, yourblackworld.com. Today, May 19th, 2020, we observe the 95th birth anniversary of one who actor and activist Ossie Davis referred to as our Black Shining Prince, otherwise known as Brother El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Brother Omar Wali, more commonly or popularly referred to as Brother Minister Malcolm X. Today, in Harlem, the streets were lit up in celebration of our Black revolutionary freedom fighter, immortal ancestor, as it always is, since the time of his untimely assassination in 1965. Every year, friends, students, and activists, admirers of Brother Malcolm, visit his gravesite. It's a ceremony led by the Organization of Afro-American Unity, an organization that he established in 1964, as well as another organization called the Sons of Africa. But back in Harlem, where he walked the streets and received his spiritual and political rites of passage, the December 12th movement had led what is referred to as the Black Power Motorcade. Usually every year, December 12th, they hold a ceremony, or they hold a protest or a commemoration ceremony in which they shut down businesses along 125th Street. They've done this for years, and businesses on their own actually take part in this most often. They shut down for maybe 2 hours in honor of Brother Malcolm. Also celebrating Brother Malcolm in Harlem is an organization, the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee. We're here joined by, right in front of us is Baba Zayid Muhammad, who was the press officer for the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee. He's also a journalist, a writer himself, a radio host, and I consider him to be, I've referred to him many times as being one of the foremost scholars on the life of Malcolm in the world. So we have him with us today. We're going to be speaking with him for a few minutes. Baba, welcome.
Oh, the pleasure is mine, son. Pleasure is all mine.
Brother Zayid, if you would, please describe Brother Malcolm's impact on the global Black liberation struggle, as it is still very unclear to many of our people.
Let me do a couple of things first. I just want to add some things to your introduction, and I want people to appreciate also. Even under this coronavirus pandemic restrictive environment, I want everybody to know that the elders of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and I'm talking especially about Baba James Small, and Ronell Collins, Malcolm's nephew. It was Ronell's mother that started the pilgrimage back in 1966, and it's something that OAU has seen to it happens every year since 1966. I want people to appreciate that. I want the people to appreciate that the young men that are the students of James Small, who have an organization called Sons of Africa, helped James pull off a ceremony today that happened to be as enriching as all of the others, in spite of the limitations. We could only allow like 10 people into the cemetery at a time. So we couldn't do the public thing today, but they still did a beautiful ceremony. I just posted it on the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee Facebook page if folks want to actually witness that themselves. Second, December 12th movement has been shutting down 125th Street for 27 years. We started doing that in 1993. Before something called the New African Liberation Front. Those are the nationalist forces that got together to do some things back in that day. My organization, the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee, took the position that we needed to take the gravesite ceremony and make it grow. And so we did a lot to promote and propagandize that, and a lot to get people to appreciate its political, spiritual, and its cultural value, right? And that became an international event as a consequence of our participation. So I just wanted to get that out. And May 19th belongs to Malcolm. That's the day when we do. I just hosted a powerful forum, Malcolm X Speaks in the 90s Beyond COVID-19, and Chickens Coming Home to Roost. Almost 4,000 people checked in on Facebook to witness that forum. That's quite a lot of attention, and it was very healthy. So I wanted to thank everyone who chimed in, and that was very much available for those who haven't seen it on our Facebook page again. Now, to your question, there's several levels to your question. One is the local level. What does it mean for our struggle within the United States? What does it mean for our people here? Second level, what does it mean to our people internationally? What does it mean for our people in Africa as a Pan-African expression? And finally, what does it mean for the entire larger international community in that ultimate struggle against oppression that takes place between the former colonizers of the northern hemisphere and their formerly colonized subjects who are trying to break free now from neo-colonial arrangements in the southern hemisphere, right? And so Malcolm made sure that the Black liberation movement here in the United States was a pivotal expression of solidarity that could have influence, have impact, and be relevant in all of those spheres. Let's unpack that. First, Malcolm, as I've always said, rescued our movement here from the confined clutches of white liberal philanthropy and American reform constrained kinds of oversight. The so-called civil rights movement as we know it has never been an independent movement. It's a movement that has always been funded by sources outside of the community. And those forces fund this organizations like those organizations to keep them going, but so far in their demand for change. So this is a dynamic that has always hung over the civil rights movement like a cloud. So the civil rights movement would not contemplate charging the United States government with genocide, even though our people were clearly facing genocidal conditions here in the United States, because that's out of the purview of what their funders would allow, and what is also, for the most part, out of the purview of their own consciousness, because they were not necessarily about revolution and being a part of the broader struggle for revolutionary change that was in the world. Malcolm came along and changed that. He changed that. He changed that first by giving folks who had problems with the limitations of the civil rights movement, particularly nonviolence also, not just the funding, but the limitations of nonviolence, and gave Malcolm and those who were not going to be confined to the limitations, a place to go to, or to create places to go to that were as legitimate expressions of struggle as were the sanctioned expressions of struggle that was our civil rights movement. But Malcolm takes it further. Malcolm says that our struggle should be in the international community, should be a human rights struggle, should be the kind of thing where we can bring in the pressure of countries around the world who understand the question what human rights actually looks like to bear even on this superpower that is the United States through embarrassment, okay, and through solidarity, right? So his campaign, you know, even in his nation days, his presidents represented a breakthrough, a breaking up or breaking of the chains of the limitations of the civil rights movement. So that's, we want to get that straight first. Second, we talk about Malcolm in Africa. We need to talk about Malcolm in Africa because that doesn't get talked about. Malcolm in Mecca gets talked about, right? That he went to Mecca and saw a broader, so-called universal expression of Islam, and changed his orientation on how he saw Islam that was different from the Nation of Islam. Yeah, that's true, right? But that's not all he did. He also tried to bring those of us who were Muslims following him into expressions of international Islamic solidarity that was anti-colonial, that was anti-imperialist. So Islam, for many, is considered an ideology of resistance, right? Like socialism is an ideology of resistance to capitalism. Islam had its moments in the early days of the non-aligned movement as being an ideology of resistance. And Malcolm raised the question of Islam as an ideology of resistance by making the moves that he was trying to make. Not just trying to get along with some other folks who are possible to get along with in peace. If you listen to how some of us roll, who've been trying to figure out how y'all could get along with them, and they still haven't allowed us to do that, right? Then, of course, right, like I said, the struggle that was going on against colonialism, known as then as the non-aligned movement, right? Malcolm, in his classic Message to the Grassroots, what does he talk about? He talks about the Bandung Conference of 1955, an epic conference of just a small number at that time, this is 1955, of newly independent black and brown nations from Asia, Africa, and very few from Latin America, but mostly Asia and Africa, meaning Indonesia, China, Nkrumah's Ghana wasn't even independent at that point, you know. So even Africa was limited in its ability to contribute to that. But that's where the marching orders were clear in terms of an international front of human solidarity. It came out of Bandung, and that's what created the non-aligned movement. Malcolm made sure that our struggle, once we dared elevate it to a struggle for human rights, would very much be a part of that broad expression of international human solidarity against global oppression that came first from colonialism and capitalism, and now as we see it in neo-colonial arrangements where the old colonial governments continue to strangle the wealth out of their former colonies by continued control of their economies, right? And of course, there have been revolutions that have defied neocolonialism, and particularly, we cannot disregard and underappreciate the incredible value and legacy of the Cuban Revolution, right? The Cuban Revolution was not an anti-colonial revolution. Cuba had already gotten its independence from Spain, only to be dominated by the United States upon Spain's weakness coming out of the Spanish-American War in the 19th century. However, Cuba's revolution was against neo-colonial domination. The neo-colonial order that literally turned black women into a sea of prostitutes and maids and mammies and all of those kind of things that you associate with some of the worst expressions of our oppression, into a truly liberated zone that was socialist in its ideology and had none of the other former trappings in its economic structure of its former colonial relations with Spain or with the United States. So it was a true revolutionary expression that's been an important source of inspiration and solidarity for the longest. And Malcolm was hugely appreciative of that, and the solidarity that exists between the black radical tradition of our struggle and the Cuban Revolution is legendary. There's a reason why Asada's in Cuba and not somewhere else, because of that long history, that long respect for struggle, mutual respect for struggle, that is international human solidarity that Cuba typifies like very few do in the world.
Okay, what I wanted to ask you, Brother Zayid, now, you mentioned Africa, and as you had noted, his trip in Africa in 1964 is often ignored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need to spend a little more time on that. I just gave you an outline, right?
Right.
Between, well, the first trip when he made his pilgrimage, he also went to Ghana. He also went to Nigeria. He also went to Ethiopia. Those were short stays, but those stays laid the stage for him to return and to participate in some of the important convenings of what was then the Organization of African Unity at that time. And he addressed, through memorandum, given an observer's seat at the OAAU Council of African States back in July of 1964, that was unprecedented. And since Malcolm's death, nothing has come anywhere close in terms of a broad expression and representation of solidarity with our people's struggle here coming through somebody like that. So Malcolm was truly way ahead of his curve of that. So that trip was an involved trip. That trip was laying the groundwork for what ultimately become Malcolm's challenge to the United States at the United Nations with the violation of our human rights to genocidal proportions. And of course, he is assassinated before that can get to that ultimate ground. But we have seen in critical expression in UN forums coming from African states and Asian states that you can see where the tide was beginning to turn towards what he was doing, right? It's hugely important, because we cannot allow ourselves to be limited to the goodwill of our oppressors, the goodwill of their instruments of management of their empire, when those instruments have never represented justice for our people, except for those rare moments where we are in mass expression on the streets got them worried about us burning the country down. And that's the only time we tend to get a little justice from them.
Now, we're going to conclude with this here. We find often that those who consider themselves to be disciples of Dr. King, if you would, oftentimes big up Dr. King, but they downplay Brother Malcolm's role. And you and I both heard this before. Well, in comparison, Malcolm didn't get any laws changed. He didn't desegregate anything. So Dr. King was the more effective leader. You've heard that before.
Sure.
How do you address that, in particular to a lot of young people or younger people whose first introduction to, a revolutionary nationalist Brother Malcolm? How do you?
The handful of reforms and rights that we have gotten that is associated with the so-called civil rights law was not won by nonviolence alone. Let's be real clear about that, right? So the role, the direct action campaigns of the civil rights movement were hugely important. In fact, Malcolm used them because it was Malcolm that was one speaking in the international arena, condemning the United States behavior, looking at how our people were being treated in a nonviolent context by the racism and the terrorism and the segregationists that was here. And they didn't appreciate it necessarily, right? The leadership elements and their co-opted dimensions of their leadership didn't necessarily appreciate it. But younger people in the movement did. Younger people like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, right? Who were very studious young organizers, not like the Googlers of the day. We read books, back in the whole books back in those days, studying struggle all over the world and studying what Malcolm was saying, getting tape recordings of his speeches, bringing them in. Kwame Ture was important in the turnaround of SNCC towards black nationalism, human rights, and revolution. A-Trap Brown behind him now, Imam Jamil El-Amin in prison. Imam's brother, Ed Brown, was particularly important in cultivating a relationship between Malcolm and SNCC, right? It was Ed Brown and his wing of SNCC, they were called the National Action Group out of Washington, D.C., close to Howard University, that would facilitate those debates between Malcolm and civil rights legend Bayard Rustin, where Malcolm would beat his behind, depending on how you looked at it, right? But it was Malcolm turning around those students, right, with nationalism, with an alternative approach, alternative ideas that were not confined to the limitations of the civil rights movement that had those students thinking. That became especially important as the movement began to grow and the movement began to try to advance, only to be met by some of the most brutal violence that you can imagine. The bombing of those 4 little girls in that church on September 15th, 1963, for instance, right? That was a savage act, right? On the heels of what was called the Children's March. There were young high school and elementary age children, you have to imagine this, lining up to get arrested, to overrun and overflow the police efforts to maintain segregation through force. The response of the segregationists, well, they were meeting at that church, let's blow that church up. And they blew that church up that Sunday morning when those little girls were getting ready for Sunday school. And it made some of the adherents in the student movement and younger forces in the community say, we cannot allow them to kill our children and stay totally nonviolent. So with the progression of the movement and the advance and progression of equal violent hostility, you see more students beginning to look and listen and pay attention to what Malcolm was talking about. And that would ultimately lead to a transformation within the movement, within that particular organization. So I have often said that students or young people went into the 1960s children of Martin Luther King, but by the end of the 1960s, they were children of Malcolm X. And the biggest expression of that is 1968, April 4th, when Martin Luther King is assassinated, and the Black Panther Party goes through its third and its largest growth spurt as a national organization, because that's when black youth said, this is the straw that breaks our black camel's back. If you're going to kill him, then there's no way in hell we can allow ourselves to stay nonviolent and be defenseless so you can kill the rest of us.
Baba Zayid Muhammad, it's always a pleasure. We thank you very much for joining us. And uh, I must ask you, Brother Zayid, what is it that the December 12th movement always screams? 125th Street, what is it?
They got a bunch of slogans. Which one you talking about?
The favorite one, Zayid, with the, when you cross your hands, you say, who's the answer?
Mex. X.
Right.
X is the answer. Malcolm X. Oh yeah, we rock that.
I think, of course, Brother Zayid, listen, we'll be, you'll be joining us in the future, of course, for further commentaries. We appreciate your perspective as always. And
right on to Your Black World and Boyce Watkins and what they're doing. We need all the information on them so we can get right on to that. We appreciate that.
Thank you very much for tuning in, family. Black Power Hotel.